The moment Kevin closed the glass office door, I knew it wasn't going to be about performance metrics. The sterile air in the room felt heavy with the scent of ambition and the expensive, generic cologne favored by young executives. He delivered the line with a practiced ease, as though reciting a company policy. "Your pension is an acceptable casualty." My expression didn't change. Not a muscle twitched. I simply held his gaze, the way you might watch a minor car accident you have no intention of reporting. Kevin smiled, a tight, confident expression, as if sidelining a woman who had spent 25 years building this company with a handshake and a severance packet made him the victor of the corporate game. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't break down. I simply slid my ID card across the sleek desk, the same way I used to submit complex data models to managers too preoccupied to understand their own core business. I picked up the small box they'd provided, a consolation prize from a lottery I hadn't entered, and walked out. Past the receptionist who pretended to be absorbed in her screen. Past the intern who once asked me to explain the nuances of data integrity. Past the digital sign flashing a cheerful GIF about teamwork. For anyone still listening, if you haven't already, please do me a favor and hit that subscribe button. It's the only kind of validation that matters. It's truly a win when you're not in the office. I left that building not just with my potted plant and a branded mug, but with a quiet, simmering resolve, the kind of anger that doesn't scream, the kind that archives every detail. That polished junior partner in the office? He was new to the game, still believing that flashy presentations were more important than foundational knowledge. He didn't know, none of them did, that back in 2005, during a major financial downturn, I had negotiated something crucial. Something they didn't bother to read because they never assumed the quiet ones were keeping records. But I was. I always was. Stored safely in a fireproof box in my basement, tucked between a notarized copy of my first employee contract and a commemorative coaster from a company picnic, was a binding agreement. Not a footnote, not a suggestion, but a formal covenant. It tied my retirement fund, my entire pension, to something they valued just enough to covet, but not enough to truly understand. The company's 14 core software algorithms. These were the digital DNA of every platform they had ever sold to investors. I had watched their development team build upon them, as if they were untouchable, as if they were a gift from the heavens. But they weren't. They were collateral. And 20 years ago, in a meeting room that smelled of stale coffee and whiteboard markers, I made certain my name was written into the debt structure like a dormant curse. So, I went home, took off my coat, and poured a glass of Merlot. The sun was setting over my quiet suburban street, and I smiled. Tomorrow, I wasn't calling HR. I was calling David, and David doesn't talk. He recovers. The year was 2005. My hair was still dark. My knees didn't creak when I stood up. And the company, then a struggling startup desperate for funding, was too broke to provide adequate retirement plans, but too proud to admit it. They called it a temporary suspension of retirement contributions, which was corporate speak for "we're out of money, but please keep making our product." That's when I saw my opportunity. I was in that meeting because the general counsel had forgotten to take me off the calendar invite. The executives were casually discussing terms like asset securitization and licensing leverage, playing with legal jargon they barely understood. Buried in the chaos was one key word: collateralization. They were desperate. Their foundational software, 14 key algorithms covering everything from proprietary sorting logic to the user interface they now licensed to major healthcare systems, was being packaged to secure a vital credit line with a European data firm. I raised my hand. I proposed that instead of delaying my pension, they should secure it against the collateral itself. They laughed, not in a malicious way, but in a patronizing way, as if I had asked for $1 million in cash. But I placed a draft on the table, one I had prepared that morning after seeing the meeting agenda. It was ironclad. If the company failed to meet its retirement obligations to me, my pension fund would automatically convert into a senior secured creditor. And what secured it? Those 14 proprietary algorithms, every single one. The CFO at the time, a weary but astute woman named Julia, read the clause 3 times. Cheaper than a lawsuit, she muttered. It was signed, notarized, stamped, and forgotten. Well, they forgot. I didn't. Now, 20 years later, I sat on my basement floor, pushing aside boxes labeled family photos and winter clothes. I reached behind the fuse box and pulled out the fireproof lockbox. The combination was still my husband's old birthday. The hinges groaned as I opened it. There it was, tucked between a faded family portrait and a photocopy of my high school diploma. The agreement's paper was yellowed, but the ink was still sharp. It began. Whereas the employee, Valentina L. Reyes, and the employer, Innovatech Solutions, do agree. I ran my fingers over the raised seal, remembering Julia's tired eyes, remembering how the VP of product had smirked when I suggested the algorithms could ever be at risk. I felt the warmth of vindication spread through my veins. They had treated me like a historical footnote, a clerical relic, an acceptable casualty. But a relic is still an artifact. An artifact can be used as a weapon. I folded the document, slipped it into a fresh plastic sleeve, and placed it gently into my old briefcase, the one they gave me for my 10-year anniversary. Strategists don't lose their temper. We just remember everything. And I had been preparing for this day since they hired that little smirk with a fancy title and called him the head of talent optimization. They thought they had ended my career. All they did was activate my final play. David picked up on the second ring, as he always did when the name Valentina Reyes appeared on his caller ID. "Please don't tell me this is about another neighborhood dispute," he said, yawning. "I have something much better," I replied. "Do you still handle secured asset recovery?" He paused. I could hear the change in his tone through the line. "Legally, always." David didn't just deal with small-time cases. He was the legal equivalent of a sledgehammer, the guy you called when a billion-dollar company forgot where it left its integrity. In law school, he was the only one who read legal fine print for fun, while the rest of us drank cheap coffee and studied for finals. We hadn't spoken in years, but I knew his number by heart. You don't forget the person who helped you break your first corporate merger like a piñata full of golden parachutes. He arrived the next morning. No tie, a worn jacket, and a briefcase that looked as though it had seen countless boardrooms. I handed him the agreement across my kitchen table, next to a cold cup of coffee and a stack of bills. He read it once, then a second time, slower. By the third time, he leaned back and let out a low whistle. "Valentina," he said, drawing out my name. "This is real." "No, I mean it's enforceable, not just a technicality. This clause gives you first priority on all 14 algorithms listed in the appendix. They defaulted, so you are now a secured creditor." He nodded, his eyes scanning the fine print. "And not just secured, but a senior creditor. If you trigger this, you skip all the lawsuits, all the legal drama, and go straight to the core. The algorithms legally become claimable assets. They'll go bankrupt before they let that happen." I stirred my coffee. "The company is finalizing a billion-dollar merger." His eyebrows shot up. "With those algorithms in play?" I slid a copy of the merger press release across the table. He read it in silence, then chuckled. "Oh, this is perfect. They're over-leveraged, and they've priced those algorithms into their market cap. They're assuming no encumbrances, which makes your agreement the equivalent of a hidden landmine on the property." "They terminated me without reading the fine print," I said. "Well then," he replied, standing and stretching like a man about to launch a rocket through a window. "It would be impolite not to educate them." I raised an eyebrow. "We aren't sending them a memo, David. I want them to feel it." "I'll handle the paperwork," he said, slipping the agreement into his briefcase as if it were a national treasure. And Valentina, I'll only ask this once. Are you looking for a payout? No. He smiled slowly. Good, because if we do this my way, they won't offer you money. They'll offer you an apology, and they'll be begging. He left with the papers and a determined look in his eye. I stood at my kitchen sink, watching the wind chimes sway on the porch, and thought about all the nights I'd stayed late to fix compliance reports. All the thankless hours, all the condescension, all the subtle disrespect wrapped in corporate niceties. They thought I was gone. They thought I was forgotten. They never realized I was armed. And David was the bullet. I was eating a microwaved plate of pasta when the press release arrived in my inbox, forwarded by an old coworker with the subject line, "Are you seeing this chaos?" I opened it with the calm grace of a woman who already knew the ending. Innovatech Solutions announces strategic merger with Global Dynamics. It read. I almost choked on a noodle. Strategic, my foot. They put a fresh coat of paint on the balance sheet and hoped no one would notice the cracks in the foundation. They had scheduled a virtual town hall for that afternoon, a flurry of press releases and quotes from the CEO about synergy and global alignment. A corporate speak smoothie of optimism and impending failure. But buried beneath all the fanfare was one line that made my eyes twitch with satisfaction. The combined intellectual property portfolio, particularly Innovatech's proprietary AI engine and diagnostic schema, is projected to drive a 37% valuation uplift in the merged entity. Translation: they had bet the entire company on the very algorithms I had in my legal crosshairs. Even better, the valuation increase was already reflected in their public filings. Their stock had risen 11% on the announcement. Investors were praising the deal as a masterstroke of genius. I scrolled down and saw a headshot of my replacement, a kid named Chad, 29, with Director of Global Strategy under his name. He was wearing a fancy shirt and holding a reusable coffee cup, as if he had single-handedly invented efficiency. Chad had posted the same press release on his social media with the caption, "Huge day for innovation and teamwork. Proud to be a part of the future." I nearly printed it out just to spill wine on it. They were flying too close to the sun on wings made of hope and unpaid invoices. They had no idea that a quiet agreement signed 20 years ago was about to ground them. David called that evening, his voice dry as a desert road. "Did you see?" he asked. "Like watching a man juggle grenades," I replied. He chuckled. "They've committed fraud by omission. They listed the algorithms as unencumbered in their merger filing. And they sent that to the SEC. He whistled. "Oh yes, on the record. Which means if we act now, we're not just reclaiming assets. We're detonating their merger from the inside." I swirled my wine glass, feeling the satisfaction settle low in my stomach. "They're going to blame a junior analyst," I said. "Probably Chad." "Good," David replied. I took a screenshot of the press release and saved it in a folder on my desktop titled Funeral Prep, because the louder the announcement, the bigger the collapse. And if there's one thing you learn in corporate law, it's that loud victories make quiet clauses very dangerous. They were taking their victory lap in front of the world, cameras rolling, smiles plastered on like clowns at a doomed birthday party. They thought they owned the future. I was about to remind them that I owned the foundation. The subject line was so clear it could make a senior partner sweat. Notice of secured creditor action. Intellectual property collateral enforcement intent. David had drafted it with the precision of a surgeon. 4 pages, bulleted exhibits, the original agreement attached, and one clear line in bold. As of this filing, the undersigned represents Valentina L. Reyes, whose pension trust is the named senior creditor against the IP portfolio detailed in Exhibit A, herein referred to as the secured collateral. Seizure proceedings will initiate within 10 business days if the debt remains unresolved. It was sent at 9:02 a.m. on a Tuesday, perfectly timed to land in inboxes during that vulnerable pre-coffee window when even the general counsel has their guard down. It was addressed directly to the general counsel and CC'd to the board. It should have lit the place up like a Christmas tree on fire. Instead, it went straight to a junior legal assistant named Melissa. Melissa was 24, working remotely, and 2 months into her first real job. She saw the email, skimmed the subject line, saw the words pension and seizure, and assumed it was a phishing attempt. She marked it as suspicious and went back to making colorful slides for compliance presentations she didn't fully understand. I didn't know this until later, of course. At the time, I simply made tea, sat on my porch, and let the summer breeze rustle the leaves. David called me that night. "They haven't responded," he said, his tone neutral. "Expected?" I asked. He exhaled slowly. "Could be a delay. Could be arrogance. Could be simple incompetence. Let's give it time," I said. "You see, there's a special kind of satisfaction in not chasing people who think you're irrelevant." I had spent years being the quiet ghost in the machine, the one who fixed the data misfires and redlined the legal language, the one no one paid attention to unless a lawsuit was on the table. Now they had one job, read one email. And they didn't, because Valentina Reyes didn't matter anymore, because the systems they built were too big to fail, because David's notice didn't come from a big investment firm or an angry shareholder. It came from a name they didn't bother to remember. So they ignored it until 2 days later when Melissa, bless her overwhelmed heart, forwarded the email to her supervisor with a note. "Not sure, but I think this might be real." By then, the deadline clock had already started ticking. 10 business days. That's all they had. And by the time someone with an actual law degree opened that attachment and saw my name on the agreement, the first domino had already fallen. An emergency meeting was scheduled for 7:30 a.m. on a Friday, a desperate attempt to stop the bleeding before markets opened. David had given me the play-by-play. He wasn't in the room, but he knew people who were. In our world, panicked silence travels fast. Imagine this: 12 executives and 4 board members on a conference call from their home offices and expensive condos. Half of them still in their workout clothes, the other half trying to pretend they'd slept. The outside counsel joined late, breathless and pale. She was clutching a printed copy of the agreement as if it might burn her. "This clause," she said, flipping to the second page and tapping it with a pen, "is authentic, enforceable, and under current state law, binding without amendment." Silence. One of the board members, a guy who made his fortune in tech startups and luxury yachts, blinked slowly. "Are you saying she can actually take the algorithms?" "She doesn't need to take them," the attorney muttered. "They're already hers." That's when my name came up. "Who the heck is Valentina Reyes?" snapped the CFO. "The ops legal liaison we terminated last quarter," someone else whispered. "She negotiated this." They all looked around. No one had an answer. It got worse. The general counsel opened my personnel file, a small digital record that had sat in the company's server for 25 years, untouched except for generic performance reviews. Suddenly, it was tagged urgent legal hold. They scrolled through my records like archaeologists uncovering a tomb they'd already desecrated. Every memo, every footnote, every email I had ever sent with the words contractual protection or binding precedent was now under forensic review. Then came the real punch, a line from their own internal valuation sheet. Core IP portfolio contributes 67.4% to projected 10-year revenue modeling based on proprietary diagnostic schema and algorithmic engines. Translation: without those algorithms, their merger was dead. Their market cap was based on a ghost. Without that IP, Innovatech was just another overhyped software company with a half-built app and a dream. They tried to find a workaround. Someone suggested they could refactor the IP. Outside counsel shut that down quickly. It's not just the code. It's the logic, the system architecture, the UI sequences. Even the goddamn training materials reference protected diagrams. If you try to fake it, she can sue again and win. By 8 a.m., the meeting was chaos. Voices raised, blame flying like shrapnel. Someone brought up Melissa's name. She had flagged the email too late. Someone else muttered about Chad. Ah, yes. Poor Chad. Apparently, he was the one who signed off on the SEC filing that claimed the IP was unencumbered. His social media was already set to private. And me? I was sitting on my porch, wrapped in a blanket, watching hummingbirds hover over the feeder I'd hung last spring. My tea was still warm. My phone was face down. I didn't need to listen to their panic. I just needed to wait. Let the clock run down. Let the walls close in. Let the men in tailored suits and bloated egos scramble to fix a mistake they didn't even know they'd made. For 25 years, I had been the one quietly cleaning up behind them. Now, I was the one thing they couldn't clean up. I was the clause they overlooked, the curse they unlocked, and I was just getting started. The call came from a blocked number at exactly 6:13 p.m., just as the sun dropped low enough to make the dust on my window blinds glow like gold. I let it go to voicemail, then another, and another. By 6:22, there was a text from David. They finally figured out who they're dealing with. At 6:45, my phone buzzed again. This time, it was an assistant I vaguely remembered from a leadership retreat years ago. His voice was trembling. "Miss Reyes, the CEO would like to speak with you privately." I said nothing, just sipped my chamomile and let the silent panic on his end of the line fill the space. "We'd like to propose a settlement," he continued. "Full restoration of your pension benefits, plus back pay, plus a substantial gesture of goodwill." "Define substantial," I said. "7 figures, plus non-disclosure consideration." I laughed. Not a dramatic cackle, just a flat, amused exhale, like a woman watching someone try to put out a forest fire with a damp napkin. "I appreciate the creativity," I said, "but the recovery team is already on its way." Silence. I could hear muffled voices in the background, someone whispering, someone swearing. Papers were being shuffled in the frantic way only executives do when they realize their fancy titles don't come with insurance against idiocy. He cleared his throat. "Valentina, let's not escalate. The merger closes in 48 hours. If this situation delays it, both parties lose billions." "Then maybe you shouldn't have referred to me as an acceptable casualty," I said. He tried to pivot. "Look, we value your legacy. Everyone in the company does." I smiled and stared at the framed copy of my 10-year anniversary certificate. "Funny," I said. "Didn't feel very valued when you let me go with a handshake and a severance folder." Another pause, another muffled conversation in the background. "We're prepared to revise the offer. A higher number, equity options. We can even include a reappointment if that's something you'd consider." I stood up and walked to the window where my porch light buzzed against the rising dusk. My eyes landed on the manila folder still sitting on my coffee table. The covenant, the relic, the loaded gun. "Tell your CEO," I said. The window for negotiation closed when I handed that agreement over to someone who knew how to read it. I hung up. No fireworks, no speech, just a cold, clean line severed. Justice isn't loud, it's surgical. David called 10 minutes later. "They tried to buy you out?" "Yep, and you said no, of course." He chuckled. "Good. I've already scheduled the asset enforcement order with the Federal IP Recovery Unit. They'll be there before lunchtime tomorrow." "Perfect," I said. "By the way," he added, "you just became the single largest secured party in the history of their company. Is that so? Yep. And Valentina? They're terrified of you now. I didn't reply. I just stared out at the twilight, watched the wind tug at the curtains, and let that one word settle in my chest like a stone in still water. Terrified. Took them long enough. The vans rolled up at 10:04 a.m. Black, unmarked, and efficient. 3 of them, and out stepped 6 federal IP enforcement officers in navy jackets and khakis, looking like librarians who moonlight as bounty hunters. They carried clipboards, badges, and court orders so crisp you could slice an ego on them. The receptionist tried to direct them to visitor check-in. One of them politely handed her a folder. Inside was an asset seizure directive signed by a federal judge, effective immediately. They walked straight through the security gates as if Moses were parting the Red Sea of key cards. It took exactly 4 minutes for the company's internal messaging to explode. Who are these guys? Is this real? They are unplugging the R&D lab. Why are they boxing up the main server? By the time someone got legal on the line, 2 of the officers were already in the executive suite, tagging prototypes, collecting hard drives, and photographing every document that referenced the algorithm portfolio in question. The crown jewels, those 14 core algorithms, were no longer theirs. They belonged to me. The recovery team didn't argue. They simply executed. The diagnostic code was locked down. The schematics for upcoming product lines were sealed in tamper-proof bags. Training systems were shut off mid-session. A team of IT specialists, contracted through federal enforcement, cloned drives and seized version histories going back 10 years. An intern reportedly cried when they took the tablet he had just finished formatting for the merger demo. Meanwhile, the CEO, who had been pulled from a lunch meeting with investors, tried to puff up when they told him what was happening. He demanded they pause all activity immediately. They didn't even blink. One of the officers handed him the warrant. He started reading it, chest heaving, but halfway through page 2, he stopped cold. This is her, isn't it? He whispered. Valentina Reyes. The name hung in the air like gas before a match strike. PR tried to keep it under wraps, sending out a damage control memo about a routine audit verification. It didn't matter. Some junior staffer leaked a video of the agents wheeling out sealed crates labeled Innovatech IP, Secured Recovery Order 81B. Within the hour, it was on social media, then on CNBC. By 2:00 p.m., the stock had dropped 19%. By 3:30, it triggered an automatic trading freeze. Global Dynamics, their merger partner, issued a statement. We are evaluating recent developments related to Innovatech's IP portfolio. All discussions are paused pending legal review. Translation: we just found out we were buying a billion-dollar sandwich made entirely of air. David sent me a screenshot of the chaos. Emails were flying, threads were burning, and an emergency all-hands meeting was scheduled for 7:00 p.m. I was sitting on my back porch again. Same tea, same blanket. The birds didn't even flinch. He texted, "Cleanest execution I've ever seen." They walked in, tagged everything, and walked out. No shouting, no resistance, just pure surgical justice. I replied, "They finally read the clause?" "Not yet," he said, too busy choking on the consequences. That night, news anchors speculated whether this would go down as the most catastrophic internal oversight in a corporate IP case since the last big tech collapse. Comment sections were brutal. One user wrote, "Imagine firing the one person who knew where all the digital bodies were buried." Another simply posted, #Reyes effect. I didn't post anything. I didn't need to. The job was done. Not with a loud declaration, not with a vengeance speech, but with paper, signatures, and timing. I hadn't raised my voice. I'd raised the floor out from under them. As I rinsed my teacup and turned off the porch light, the only sound in my house was the soft, mechanical whir of justice, Finally, running on my terms. The press conference was scheduled for 8 a.m. sharp. But by 8:07, the CFO still hadn't made it to the podium. I was already settled on my porch, wrapped in my old college sweatshirt, coffee steaming in one hand, remote in the other. The feed buffered twice, probably due to too many people watching the train wreck in real time. Finally, there he was. Mark Daniels, CFO of Innovatech, red-eyed and trembling behind a row of microphones like a man about to propose to a firing squad. He adjusted his tie 4 times in 20 seconds. It didn't help. Due to unforeseen legacy contractual complications, he began, the board of Innovatech has voted to withdraw from the proposed merger with Global Dynamics. Behind him, one of the board members stood up and walked off camera mid-sentence. No words, no handshake, just gone. I took a slow sip. They hadn't mentioned me by name. Of course they couldn't. Saying, "We got outplayed by a woman we fired and forgot," doesn't exactly soothe shareholders. But they didn't have to say it. I was in every silence, every nervous blink, every second of flustered spin and corporate doublespeak. They said complications. I heard checkmate. My phone buzzed gently on the side table. It was David. "Congratulations, they're yours now." I didn't smile, didn't cry, just stared out over my porch railing at the soft glow of morning, pushing back the dark. There was dew on the grass, a lone squirrel wrestling with the bird feeder. Somewhere, a dog barked once and then went quiet. I took another sip of coffee. Let the heat sit on my tongue. Let the silence do its work. Across the country, journalists were scrambling for quotes. Analysts were redlining stock charts. Boardrooms were being scrubbed. And Innovatech, they were learning the difference between cost-cutting and consequences. 25 years of quiet, invisible labor. One forgotten clause. One underestimated woman. And now I owned their foundation. No applause, no parade, just this moment. Me, my porch, the sunrise, and the sound of a billion-dollar empire cracking like old paint behind me. Lesson from the story. This story teaches us that our greatest strength can be our quiet power. The most valuable contributions are often the ones made without fanfare. Never underestimate the importance of diligence, attention to detail, and a deep understanding of your work. When people treat you as an acceptable loss, they often fail to see the true value you hold. The most powerful revenge isn't loud or angry. It's a calm, well-executed plan. Be the person who not only does the work, but also understands the foundation of it, because quiet confidence and foresight can be a force that no one sees coming.